This real property hypothetical deals with land ownership. The issues presented here are commonly tested both on essays and on the multi-state bar exam. As always, start by taking a look at the call of the question. It reads, "Who owns Greenacre? Discuss." Our typical approach to a question like this will be to identify all the different parties that might have a claim on this property and then discuss each of their claims separately. Ultimately, we will reach a short answer to this question that we will frame in a conclusion. We'll give them a straight answer to the question. Go to the top of the question, and we see pretty much from the beginning that this is looking like a very conventional real property question. We see a conveyance from Owens to Abel. Abel records without doing a title examination, and Abel also obtains a loan from the bank, unsecured, as opposed to being secured by an interest in Greenacre, and Abel builds a cabin on this property. We also learn in paragraph 1 that the property is accessible only 6 months out of the calendar year, and there's really only one reason why that fact could be present in the pattern, because we're going to end up talking about adverse possession. In paragraph 2, we get all of the facts that go to adverse possession, after we learn that Owens doesn't own this property. At the time that he tried to convey Greenacre to Abel, Owens' grandfather was the true owner of the property. So now the facts in paragraph 2 about adverse possession have a somewhat greater impact. We see that from 1950 to the present day, Abel has been paying taxes on this property. He's also lived in the cabin for 1 month out of the year. Well, let's pause for a moment. Why would they tell us this fact? Answer: because it goes to the physical element of adverse possession. Is a 1 month per year occupation of a property sufficient to satisfy the occupation requirement of adverse possession? It's a fairly close call. We know the property can only be accessed 6 months out of the year, but is actually occupying the property 1 month out of the year good enough? Perhaps it's a close call, but we'll notice that the cabin and the sign occupy the property all the time, year-round, and that fact is going to be relevant as well. In paragraph 3, we meet Charlie. Charlie's the other party that has a claim to Greenacre, and as it turns out, I think that Charlie's claim may actually be the stronger claim, although this is a very well-constructed fact pattern because both of these claimants end up to having fairly persuasive claims. But look at what happens with Charlie. Charlie loans money to Abel. Then, right after that, Owen's grandfather dies, and at that point, Owens has got title to this property. So that raises the question of estoppel by deed as to Abel. So we can pause for a moment. We know what Abel's claims to Greenacre are. It is an adverse possession claim and an estoppel by deed claim. We know how to organize both of these issues because they're fairly straightforward, and we'll have to find a home for all of the facts in order to raise these arguments, but we know all we need to know right now to be able to analyze Abel's claims. So let's go back and look more at what happens with regard to Charlie in paragraph 3 of the answer. Charlie loans money to Owens. Owens' grandfather dies, leaving Greenacre to Owens. So now, in a majority of jurisdictions, Owens is going to be said to own the property. A minority of jurisdictions will use estoppel by deed in a very aggressive fashion. So later on in this paragraph, we find Charlie forgiving the $5,000 debt to Owen in return for a conveyance of a title to Greenacre. And we see also in this paragraph that Charlie lacks actual notice. And so now we've got a pretty clear idea about what Charlie's claim to this property is going to be also. He's going to be basing his claim on the Recording Act and his lack of actual notice. So we've got plenty to talk about with regard to Charlie also. Then next we are entitled to take a look at the Recording Act, which is presented. Then we get the call of the claim one more time. Who owns Greenacre? Turn the page and take a look at the outline of issues that I've presented, and you'll see this is not an easy question. And the reason why it's difficult is because we've got to carefully track everything that happens between the parties in this question, and we need to focus on their relationships as well. This is a pure real property question. We're not going to be dealing with issues arising out of contracts or torts, except in a very peripheral fashion. We know that Abel's claims to this property are going to be based on adverse possession and estoppel by deed. So let's pause for a moment and take a look at adverse possession. Now, you can use as elaborate a checklist for adverse possession as you choose to memorize. But in our discussion substantively of adverse possession, I spelled out the elaborate approach, but then I distilled it down to its essence. The way to think about adverse possession, to really understand what's going on, is to focus first on the physical aspect of occupation. Clearly, the cabin is there. The occupation is actual, it is open, and it is notorious. There's a cabin on the property with a sign there. Next, the mental element of adverse possession. We need to acknowledge, and we need to explain on an essay, that Abel is occupying this property under color of title. He is there thinking he owns it, and that's satisfactory to establish Abel's hostility as to any other potential claimant. Next, we turn to the time element of adverse possession. He's got to be there for the statutory period. Well, he's been there since 1950. I don't know of any adverse possession statute that requires occupation for substantially longer than 50 years. So it would seem that the time element is met. But we have to look more carefully at the facts. Remember, this guy is only on the land 1 month out of the year, and the property is accessible 6 months out of the year. Of course, the cabin is there continuously the whole time. But I think we've got a reasonable amount of wiggle room here to argue that this guy's adverse possession claim fails. Now, I think one could argue fairly persuasively also that it succeeds. So, Abel's claim to adverse possession is probably a fairly strong one. Next, we turn to estoppel by deed. Only a minority of jurisdictions would automatically transfer the deed to Greenacre to Abel at the time that Owens actually obtains title. A majority of jurisdictions would require a further examination of the facts and would probably find in favor of Charlie because Charlie has complied with the Recording Act and Charlie would not be under record notice of the claim that Abel might have. So the estoppel by deed claim is Abel's winning argument, but only in a minority of jurisdictions. In a majority of jurisdictions, Abel has to rely on adverse possession. And as I've indicated, that adverse possession claim is strong, but it's not rock solid. So next, we turn to Charlie's claim. And here, we do need to touch on one little issue from the law of contracts. We need to establish that Charlie's willingness to discharge a debt that is owed him is enough to establish valuable consideration. So both sides here are making a reasonable bargain for exchange. So now we turn to the issue of notice. We know that Charlie has paid value, and we also know that he lacks actual notice. But he has not physically inspected the property, and that could put him on inquiry notice. We also know that constructive notice isn't present because Abel's deed is going to end up being outside of Charlie's chain of title. So what Charlie has to rely on is the Recording Act, and the fact that the title that Abel obtained was not within his chain of title. And I think Charlie's argument is a fairly persuasive one. So if this property is in a majority jurisdiction with regard to estoppel by deed, Charlie's claim is pretty strong. And my view is very marginally that Charlie might have the better claim, at least in a majority of jurisdictions. But Abel's claims to Greenacre are persuasive also. Many of you may conclude that his adverse possession claim is a winner, and I can't say you're wrong if you do. In a minority of jurisdictions, Abel's estoppel by deed claim is a winner, an automatic winner. And the reason why Charlie would then have no claim to title is because at the time that Charlie received the conveyance, the grantor didn't have title. If Owens doesn't have title to the property at the time that he purports to convey it to Charlie, the conveyance fails. So if you like Abel's adverse possession claim, or if you're writing in a jurisdiction in which estoppel by deed is automatic, Abel wins. But if you're in a majority of jurisdictions which do not apply estoppel by deed automatically, Charlie's claim might turn out to be the stronger claim, particularly if you are not sympathetic to Abel's claim by adverse possession. This is a hypothetical that presents tricky issues dealing with land ownership, and as you continue to practice, I think you'll find this question is quite representative.